So today I have with me Professor Sally Brinkman from the University of South Australia, who's a social epidemiologist with a focus on early childhood development and the impact of society on children's short and long-term outcomes. Good afternoon, Sally. Welcome to this interview.
Thank you.
So the reason I got Sally to graciously accept my invitation to have this interview is because I've been familiar with her research for many years now on specifically the simulated infants program and the randomized controlled trial that she did that was published in the Lancet. So just as a quick recap, the simulated infants are those pretend babies that were very popular, especially around the 90s. By some estimates, around 1 million children were exposed to this program. The point of it was to try and reduce pregnancies. Now, Sally's research, fascinatingly, found that it actually had the opposite effect. If anything, it increased pregnancies quite a bit. And back of the envelope calculation is that maybe around 60,000 extra pregnancies may have been caused by this program globally. That's a pretty sort of dodgy estimate if you were to extrapolate the findings, but nevertheless, it gives you a sense of just the scale of the kind of effects that this program may have had globally. So without further ado, I'll get Sally to answer some questions. I've just got to find my questions. Okay, so firstly, could you tell us just a little bit about the background of this study? Why did your team decide to do this work?
So at that stage, I was the epidemiologist for the health service. So I was actually working as a government employee rather than academic at the time. And we ran part of the program included a whole lot of school health nurses. And many of the school health nurses really liked this program. They were already using it, but the infant simulators were super expensive. So, I mean, this was done well over 10 years ago now, but each of those infant simulators were over $1,000 each, and there was maintenance costs and everything else. And so at that time, I was part of the executive of the health service, and we had got I suppose, a business case by the school health nurses to say that they wanted us to invest in buying a whole lot more babies. But being the epidemiologist, I was like, well, we have no actual evidence to know whether these really work or not. And considering it's a significant investment, if we do go forward with it, then, I wanted to make sure that we would be able to evaluate the impact. So that was agreed, and the health department kicked in in-kind support and funding, and then we put in a grant application into Healthway WA, and that was successful. So that meant, and actually Lotteries West as well kicked in some money, and so that meant that we could go and buy, I think it was 40 additional babies, infant simulators, and all of the paraphernalia that comes with them, and we started doing a trial. So that's how it started, was really just trying to work out if this was a sensible investment or not to make, and whether it made sense to expand it across the health service or not. So it was
Right.
practically based.
So it was kind of like a cost benefit kind of analysis, really, like in the sense of, what was this actually worth the investment? And did you have a sense before you commenced that the effect could be actually in the opposite direction as everybody believed for all of the years and across all the contexts in which it's been used?
No, look, I mean, I'm afraid I'm a fairly cynical person, so I wasn't sure that it worked, but I did not expect that it would have the opposite impact. So I was not prepared for that. That was not what I had predicted. I just didn't think it would work very well at all. So I wasn't expecting to see any outcome. The fact that we got to see the opposite outcome as was expected was not something that we'd prepared for. In fact, the original trial was powered on the basis of just being able to show a single direction, right? Just that it was going to reduce pregnancy. We did not actually even power it to to be able to enable to see whether it actually increased pregnancy.
Yeah, is that why the sort of the main results are reported as saying as focusing on there not being a significant direction effect in that direction? Yeah,
Exactly.
I thought that might have been the case. Um, and was this the first RCT done on simulated infants globally?
Yes. So there were a couple of papers that claimed to be randomized, but when you actually looked at them, they weren't randomized at all. And they tended to be very small scale, couple PhD studies. So it became an issue actually when we published the results in the Lancet. The makers of the infant simulators were somewhat unhappy, shall we say, uh, and actually tried to legally sue the Lancet with potential follow-up to us as well. And so that became quite dramatic. Was not something that we were expecting or necessarily prepared for. And part of their reasoning for the legal case was that we had said that there had been no randomized controlled trials, and so they they basically said, oh no, there have been. And so we ended up having to do quite a bit of additional work to actually go through all of the, well, not all of the few papers, and they weren't even really papers, they were generally just reports, and making sure that we had interpreted them all correctly, and we were able to do that easily, and that's all on record with the Lancet Publication Office now as well, if anybody else wants to further query it.
So that's fascinating. The thing that just really just sort of amazes me about this study and about this context is just um, how far a given program can go, just on the basis of a gut feeling, if you like, that it's going to be a good thing, and how much can be invested in it before somebody actually tests it, to see whether it actually works. When the study came out, what kind of an impact did it have?
Well, I mean, the media frenzy was dramatic, and from all over the world, especially from the US. And interestingly, Ireland, we got a lot of interest in Ireland, and mainly that was because the program was quite prolific in the Catholic education systems.
Right.
So that was sort of an interesting debate. And then the discussion for them was more about, well, you might be increasing pregnancy, but are the children that are born from those pregnancies healthier? And, um, I mean, there's plenty of evidence to show that teenage pregnancy biologically may be okay, but from when you take into account all the socioeconomic factors and educational outcomes and everything else, then generally you see poorer outcomes for the children that are born of teenage mothers. And that's more about socioeconomics than it is anything to do with actually the biological process. So there was quite a few debates around that, but it really did it did spark interest around the world. But we were, I suppose, honestly, we were just so caught up with stressing out about the legal ramifications that were coming at us from the makers of the babies. And if you look at their website today, they don't mention teenage pregnancy prevention at all, but
Mm,
they have, I mean, they've gone from strength to strength. So
really?
they have a whole lot more products now. And the way they're marketing it is very much around childcare studies. So if you're at high school and you want to become, a childcare worker or work as a, preschool teacher, then they're very marketing from that point of view. So it's sort of like, how do you learn how to look after babies? And then they have a whole lot of other sort of products, like fetal alcohol baby, and a baby with skin conditions, and a baby with heart conditions, and all these other sorts of things. So, you know, when we first did the trial, I think there were 2 versions of the baby, and it now seems there's about 50 versions of the baby. So,
Right.
so the company seems to have not had any negative implications for them.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember reading one of the media articles that came out about that around that time. It was interviewing some principals from the US. I can't remember what the outlet was. Um, and they were sort of showing this information from the study saying, well, you know, what do you think about the simulated infants now if they actually increase pregnancy? And it seemed like they really wanted to believe in the product. And as you were saying, um, often reframing what its objectives
Yeah.
are. One of them was saying that it's not actually about reducing pregnancy. It's about sort of creating more sort of better young people, really. Make them more kind of aware of what family life is, and they just become better people. That was kind of like the reframe. It was very interesting. It did actually make me think quite a lot about how I guess RCTs are designed to test what is the explicit aim of a given program, uh, and yet the sort of the supplementary aims may be very different depending on who it is that's actually um, believing or championing a given intervention. So I found that quite interesting. So
Well, they changed the name. So it used to be called Baby Think It Over,
yeah.
quite clearly around, you know, teenage pregnancy prevention, and all the material, the resources and everything else were very much designed to, you know, that was the main marketing, was that this was going to prevent teenage pregnancy. And now it's all about real care and caring for babies, and how, you know, exactly as you said, you know, you become a better person because you know how to care for a baby. I mean, you know, to a certain extent, fine, but do we need to do it in schools with teenagers if this is going to be the outcome? Now, they would probably argue, well, you know, they've taken out the material around, you know, contraception use and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. But, you know, at the end of the day, we suspect what really occurs when, I mean, you know, we had more than 1,000 kids go through this, and we had so much feedback from the school health nurses. And of course, none of that's written in the Lancet paper, but, you know, many of the nurses were saying that, you know, some of these students became extremely attached to these fake babies. In some circumstances, they needed to get school psychologists in to actually
Mhm.
help support the students when they had to give the baby back at the end of the weekend. And they would get upset because, you know, there was another student that they didn't like so much would have their baby the following weekend. And so the level of attachment was quite strong for many of the students. We also found that it became quite, and again, this is all just, you know, from the reports of the students. This isn't quantitative data that we collected or reported on, but, you know, many of the students found it a very strong, I suppose, family initiative, because, you know, they're taking the baby home into their home environment, and it became a family thing to help support the student to look after their baby. So it ended up being a really, you know, positive experience for some students. For others, it was a really negative experience where, like, the maximum crying time the baby can report is 999 minutes of crying. So these infant simulators, you get data out of them afterwards. You know, you can download information. And yeah, they can record 999 minutes. And so some students, when they handed their baby back, you know, had this recording. this maximum amount of time. And then, of course, the school health nurse would ask, what happened? And we would get stories of, generally the student's father getting so annoyed with the baby crying all the time that they, wrapped it up with a sleeping bag and shoved it in the back shed of the,
Oh God.
of the yard. So there were some very interesting stories. The entire study group were support people for the whole, we took turns. And so invariably we would get at least one phone call every weekend where a family was complaining and saying, we want this baby switched off. It's just way too annoying. And there is a secret way of being able to switch the babies off.
Okay.
So, so we would be able to tell the parents this information so that they could switch it off. But yeah, just that, I suppose the level of emotional attachment
Mm,
and the impact that it had to the families over the weekends was quite outstanding and something that we really underestimated before
mm, mm.
the trial.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A lot of the reactions that you've mentioned were pushback and people standing their ground and trying to defend the intervention. Um, yeah, a sort of idealized view of what an RCT will do is it'll suddenly change everyone's mind. Uh, d- did you get a sort of positive element of feedback and impact after that study came out in terms of how this intervention was perceived?
So it was, so we conducted it in Western Australia. So clearly our health service decided that we would not continue at all with the intervention. So we gave all of the fake babies to nursing homes. So
Okay.
because many of the nursing homes used to use them for the elderly and to be able to look after some fake babies rather than real babies. And so we sort of handed them off. So we never implemented it from that point forward. The education department in Western Australia put out a letter to all schools in WA to say, that they didn't endorse the program anymore. They didn't go to the extent of saying we will ban the use of the simulators, but they were fairly strong in saying that, we didn't really want to see it going anymore. The independent schools did ban it. The Catholic schools did not ban it. So that was sort of interesting to see the
And
difference
that's
as
you're
well.
speaking purely about within Western Australia, right?
Yeah.
To what extent do you think it's likely that the study has external validity outside of the very specific circumstances of Western Australia or the specific areas within Western Australia?
So I think I there's no reason I don't think as to why it couldn't be generalized across Australia for sure, at least into the main populous states. Mainly because the schools that we included in the study were quite a diverse socioeconomic mix. So we had everything from sort of the poorer socioeconomic to some of the richest communities. We had some schools with, high ethnic diversity and others not so much. So we weren't really powered, I suppose, to do a deep dive into subgroup analyses, but we didn't really see anything, didn't really see any sort of major differences when we did have a quick look at that. So I can't really see why it wouldn't necessarily have the same sort of generalizability of the impact in the other states.
And did you have reactions from globally, I guess? I mean, I would have thought if a study like this came out in the Lancet, then every jurisdiction around the world who's using that would be it would really be appropriate for them to either immediately change their policy or fund a replication study within their own jurisdiction to see what
Yeah.
happens there. Did that happen to any
Yeah,
extent?
we do not know of any replication study. Um,
None.
in
Amazing.
in the US, it would have been great if, in particular, because I think in the US in particular, it's quite prolific. But I think the access to contraception and abortion and other aspects, the sort of stigmatization around teenage pregnancy is quite different to Australia. So I think it would be nice to see a replication. But some colleagues, academic colleagues of mine, have mentioned that it would be sort of almost impossible to do because there's just so many of the infant simulators already. It would be very, very difficult to be able to have a control scenario.
Wow.
So that that seems to be a major challenge. So my understanding is that the program is still continuing just as it did. There was hardly any blip at all in America or in there was a my understanding is there was some drop in Ireland and in the UK. But again, this is just sort of anecdotal. I don't have any sort of strong quantitative data to show. And yeah, as I mentioned, the company has sort of seemingly gone from strength to strength by just reframing.
Hmm. And so why do you think that is? I mean, I guess there's a number of possible interpretations. One of them is that people in the US kind of just don't think that what happens in Western Australia is relevant, and therefore they don't see it as a cause of concern. Or another interpretation is that um, the scientific method or the quality of the journal isn't sort of recognized sufficiently in the right forums. Or another interpretation is that legitimately, um, people are not particularly concerned about the effect on teenage pregnancies, and they care about all these other outcomes they speak about, or something else. I'm not sure. Like, what's your interpretation of the fact that this keeps thriving?
I don't know. I think research translation is really hard.
Mm,
And even when you have strength of evidence of a trial, maybe as an academic, I continue to be naive in thinking that strong RCT evidence is going to change the world. But it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. The commercial interests seem to be strong. We can't compete either really with the marketing. So, I mean, we had funding to be able to undertake the trial. Once the funding ceased, we continued to do the tracking of the students over time in our own time as principal investigators. So we sort of essentially sort of subsidized the study as we continued to go forward with tracking the students, and so that partly why it took the time that it did to be able to get the results out, because we weren't funded to continue with the work. So we knew the answers, so we were able to sort of change and address some of the policies within our own health service. But other than that, it was difficult for us to continue to disseminate the results widely, other than post, through the press straight after the publication was released. So, unless there was some significant sort of communication funds to be able to continue to push the information out, why would any school in any country necessarily look up the Lancet and find the results, right? And so I think it's tough when you've got a clearly very successful company that's going from strength to
mm,
strength, who's willing to be litigious. Um, it's pretty hard for a single paper in the Lancet to compete against that, even
sure.
the Lancet.
And within Australia, the other jurisdictions, what are they doing now?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. So there are many schools that are using it for the childcare studies, and that seems to be fairly, fairly common. But I'm not aware of schools using it with the primary aim of teenage pregnancy prevention. Every now and again, somebody will tell me that their daughter or granddaughter or whatever has access to one of these infant simulators, and then either I or somebody else will phone the school and just sort of say, hey,
It's just so that you
just
know.
wondering. But yeah, but that's about it really. So we haven't been able to sort of continue to track to see what's going on. So that's just it's an unfortunate part. But I am happy that at least the company is not still pushing it as a teenage pregnancy prevention program. So that's at least that's one tick, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So here's a bit of a speculator question. Just wondering on your thoughts on the use of RCTs just broadly within Australian policy making. So I mean, obviously they're quite prevalent in medicine and have been for a long time, and health around that. But in social programs, they're nowhere near as common. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. So yeah, look, clearly I am a supporter of RCTs. And I now find myself within an education faculty within a university, where knowledge of RCTs, understanding of RCTs and what they can do, the different designs that are possible to make RCTs sort of more ethical as such as clustering by schools like we did with our original trial. The knowledge is not there. It doesn't seem to be included within the studies. So if you're going to study to become a social worker, or if you're going to study to become a teacher, research methodology is not taught in the same way as it's taught within the health sciences. And I think that's quite unfortunate. There is a lot of programs that go on within education systems in particular that are theoretically driven, rather than necessarily having a strong evidence base behind them. And I would like to see that, personally, I would like to see that strengthened. But yeah, there's sort of this immediate reaction of, oh, well, that's RCTs are unethical. It's just sort of like, oh, really? Why? And there's just this immediate sort of reaction to them. And I think it's just people's lack of knowledge around RCTs and how they're designed and why they're designed the way they are, and how you are able to it's the only way of being able to causally say whether an intervention has worked or not. And there's lots of causal modelling and lots of statistical approaches that are improving, but at the end of the day, an RCT is still going to give you the gold standard evidence. Of course, there's still the issue of generalizability and everything else, and there's debates in, I work mainly now in low middle income countries, and so some of the work that I do for the World Bank is very much around RCTs, and there's a real willingness to undertake RCTs within the bank. But then when you go to other donors like UNICEF and UNESCO and others, then they're not so keen. So there are sort of divisions and debates, and it's called the randomistas, and I mean, would be very well aware of the debates within the literature, academic literature, around the advantages and disadvantages of randomized controlled trials and how far you can go with them or not. But I don't, my feeling is I have continued to try to do trials as well as being able to do the causal modelling approaches, and at the end of the day, I would still advocate for trials over the other sort of statistical approaches if possible. But getting funding for them, getting commitment for them is not so easy. We just thankfully got NHMRC partnership grant to evaluate a self-regulated learning trial here in South Australia, which is actually, as I understand it, the first full-scale randomized controlled trial that the Department for Education here in South Australia has ever committed to. And so we're hoping that not only will we be able to get strong results, but we will also be able to use the opportunity to, I suppose, exemplify what an RCT can do, and how they're not as scary as many people think that they are, and that there's ways of being able to design them that are still, ethical. So, yeah. There's lots of organisations like Social Ventures Australia, I don't know if you've come across them, that have been trying to advocate for higher evidence in and the use of RCTs. So there are different groups. There's a group coming out of Treasury that's just started up, that is really through Andrew Lee's advocation. So he's an economist by background and a minister with the current federal government. And his background training at Harvard was very much based in RCTs, and he is a supporter of them. So there are a few people here and there that are trying to advocate for RCTs, or at least more than there currently exists within Australia. So yeah, hopefully over time we might see something push up a little bit.
Professor Sally Brinkman, I think that's a really good note on which to end the recorded interview. So I'm gonna hit stop now.